In the shadowed halls of Renaissance Florence, where whispered conspiracies could topple princes and where a man's survival depended upon his ability to read the true intentions behind honeyed words, there lived one who understood better than any the art of mental sovereignty. Niccolò Machiavelli, exiled diplomat and keen observer of human nature, had witnessed firsthand how minds could be captured, manipulated, and controlled by those who understood the mechanics of influence. From his modest dwelling on the outskirts of the city, he penned observations that would echo through centuries, not merely on how to acquire power, but on something far more precious: how to protect one's mind from becoming another's instrument. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as Machiavelli walked through the marketplace, observing the merchants hawking their wares, the nobles parading in their finery, and the common folk going about their daily business. Each interaction he witnessed was a lesson in the subtle art of persuasion and control. A merchant's exaggerated claims about his goods, designed to cloud judgment with urgency and desire. A nobleman's casual display of wealth, meant to establish social hierarchy and command deference. A priest's sermon, weaving moral authority with political messaging to shape the congregation's worldview. These observations crystallized into what he came to call the fundamental truth of human interaction: every encounter contains within it an attempt at influence, and those who remain unaware of this reality become unwitting participants in their own mental subjugation. The mind, he realized, was the ultimate territory to be conquered or defended, and most people surrendered it without even realizing a battle was being fought. Part 1: The Architecture of Mental Vulnerability. The first principle that emerged from Machiavelli's observations was the recognition that the human mind, for all its remarkable capabilities, possessed inherent vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who understood them. Like a fortress with hidden weak points that only experienced siege engineers could detect, the mind had predictable patterns of weakness that made it susceptible to capture. He had seen this most clearly during his diplomatic missions, where he watched skilled negotiators and political manipulators work their craft. They did not attack the mind directly through obvious lies or crude propaganda. Such approaches were easily recognized and resisted. Instead, they worked through what he termed the backdoors of consciousness, the emotional triggers, cognitive biases, and social pressures that bypassed rational analysis and spoke directly to the primitive parts of human psychology. The merchants in the marketplace provided perfect examples of these techniques in action. Rather than simply stating the quality and price of their goods, they created elaborate narratives designed to engage specific psychological responses. They spoke of scarcity to trigger fear of missing out. They employed social proof by claiming that important people had purchased similar items. They used anchoring by first showing expensive items before revealing their reasonably priced alternatives. Each technique was a key that unlocked a particular door in the customer's mental defenses. Machiavelli understood that the first step in defending one's mind was to map these vulnerabilities with ruthless honesty. He began cataloging the primary weakness patterns he observed. The human tendency to seek confirmation of existing beliefs made people vulnerable to those who presented information that aligned with their preconceptions, regardless of its accuracy. He watched as political factions fed their supporters carefully selected facts and interpretations that reinforced their worldview while ignoring contradictory evidence. The supporters felt informed and confident in their positions, never realizing they were consuming a diet of intellectual poison that gradually narrowed their ability to think independently. The desire for social acceptance created another exploitable weakness. People would adopt opinions, behaviors, and beliefs not because they had carefully evaluated them, but because they sensed these positions would earn them approval from groups they wished to join or maintain standing within. Machiavelli observed how skilled manipulators would create artificial social pressures, making their targets believe that compliance with certain ideas or behaviors was necessary for social survival. The human need for certainty and simplified explanations made minds vulnerable to those offering clear, definitive answers to complex questions. In times of uncertainty or crisis, people would abandon critical thinking in favor of anyone who promised to make sense of chaos, regardless of whether their explanations were accurate or self-serving. Machiavelli watched demagogues and false prophets exploit this weakness, offering simple explanations for complex problems and gaining devoted followings among those desperate for clarity. Perhaps most insidiously, he observed how the natural human tendency to defer to authority could be weaponized. People would accept information and directives from those they perceived as legitimate authorities, even when those authorities had clear conflicts of interest or questionable expertise. The manipulation lay not in the abuse of legitimate authority, but in the creation of false or exaggerated authority through carefully constructed credentials, impressive titles, or associations with respected institutions. These vulnerabilities were not character flaws or signs of weakness, they were natural features of human psychology that had served survival purposes in simpler social environments. The problem arose when sophisticated manipulators learned to exploit these features for their own ends in complex modern societies. The challenge was to retain the benefits of these psychological tendencies while developing defenses against their exploitation. The second fundamental insight that shaped Machiavelli's approach to mental defense was the recognition that information itself had become a weapon. In his time, controlling information flow was primarily a matter of controlling physical documents and restricting who could read or write. The mechanisms were crude but effective. Only the educated elite had access to books, and news traveled slowly through limited channels that could be easily monitored or influenced. But Machiavelli foresaw a future where information would become both more abundant and more dangerous. He imagined scenarios where those who controlled information channels could shape reality itself by determining what people knew, when they knew it, and how it was presented to them. This was not merely about hiding truth or spreading lies, it was about creating entire systems of perception that would make certain thoughts impossible and others inevitable. He began developing what he called the ecology of influence framework, an understanding of how ideas spread through social networks and how this process could be manipulated. Just as a farmer could influence crop growth by controlling soil conditions, water, and nutrients, skilled manipulators could influence thought patterns by controlling the informational environment in which minds operated. The key was understanding that most people did not actively seek out information, they passively absorbed whatever was present in their environment. Their opinions and beliefs were shaped not by careful research and analysis, but by the accumulated effect of countless small exposures to information throughout their daily lives. A comment overheard in a coffee shop, a headline glimpsed while walking past a newsstand, a story told by a friend, these seemingly insignificant inputs combined to create powerful belief systems. Manipulators who understood this process could shape minds by carefully curating these environmental exposures. They could ensure that certain ideas appeared everywhere while others seemed to disappear entirely. They could make fringe positions seem mainstream by creating artificial consensus, and they could marginalize legitimate concerns by associating them with discredited sources or unpopular groups. The third pillar of Machiavelli's framework for understanding mental vulnerability was the recognition that emotions, rather than logic, were the primary drivers of human decision-making. While people believed they made rational choices based on careful analysis of available information, the reality was that emotional responses usually predetermined conclusions, with rational analysis serving merely to justify decisions that had already been made at an unconscious level. This was perhaps the most disturbing observation in his entire catalogue of human psychological weaknesses, because it suggested that even highly intelligent, well-educated people were far more susceptible to manipulation than they realized. The manipulator's task was not to convince the rational mind, it was to trigger specific emotional states that would make desired conclusions feel inevitable. Fear was the most powerful and reliable emotion for control purposes. A population that lived in constant low-level fear could be directed toward almost any course of action by those who promised safety and security. The fear did not need to be rational or proportionate to actual threats. Indeed, irrational fears were often more effective because they could not be easily dispelled through evidence or logical argument. Anger was almost as powerful and had the additional advantage of creating energy that could be directed toward specific targets. Skilled manipulators could cultivate anger through careful narrative construction, helping their targets identify enemies to blame for their frustrations and disappointments. The anger would then serve as motivation for actions that served the manipulator's purposes. Hope and desire could be equally effective for control, particularly when combined with careful management of reward schedules. By creating cycles of anticipation and partial satisfaction, manipulators could keep their targets in states of psychological dependency, always believing that full satisfaction was just around the corner if they continued to comply with direction. Pride and social identity were perhaps the most sophisticated emotional tools, because they could make targets feel as though they were exercising free will even while being carefully directed. By associating desired behaviors with group identity and personal values, manipulators could make compliance feel like authentic self-expression rather than submission to external control. Understanding these emotional mechanics was crucial for developing effective defenses, because it revealed that traditional approaches to resisting manipulation, such as fact-checking, logical analysis, and skepticism, were necessary but not sufficient. The mind under emotional influence would simply find ways to rationalize whatever the emotions demanded, no matter how strong the contrary evidence. As Machiavelli synthesized these observations into a coherent framework, he realized that the challenge of mental defense was far greater than most people imagined. It was not simply a matter of being skeptical or well-informed, it required a fundamental restructuring of how one processed information and made decisions. It demanded a level of self-awareness and emotional discipline that few people possess naturally, and that even fewer were willing to develop through deliberate practice. Yet he also recognized that the stakes could not be higher. In a world where minds could be captured and controlled through sophisticated manipulation techniques, mental sovereignty was not a luxury but a necessity for anyone who wished to live as something more than an unwitting instrument of others' ambitions. The choice was stark: develop ruthless defenses against mental manipulation, or accept a life of unconscious servitude to those who understood these principles better. This recognition led him to the development of what would become his most important work, not the strategies for acquiring political power that would make him famous, but the principles for maintaining psychological independence that would prove far more valuable to individuals seeking to preserve their autonomy in an increasingly manipulated world. Part 2: The Fortress of Autonomous Thought. The development of effective defenses against mental manipulation required first accepting an uncomfortable truth: the human mind, in its natural state, was not designed for the complexity and dangers of sophisticated social environments. Like an immune system that had evolved to fight simple infections but struggled against engineered bioweapons, the mind's natural defenses were inadequate against modern manipulation techniques. Machiavelli understood that this was not a failing to be ashamed of, but a reality to be addressed through systematic strengthening and modification of natural mental processes. Just as a wise ruler would fortify his city's walls and train his soldiers in advanced combat techniques, an individual seeking to preserve mental autonomy had to deliberately construct defenses that went beyond what nature provided. The first line of defense was what he called information hygiene, a systematic approach to controlling what entered the mind and how it was processed. Most people consumed information indiscriminately, like someone who would eat anything placed in front of them without considering its source, quality, or potential effects. They read whatever newspapers were available, listened to whatever opinions were expressed in their social circles, and absorbed whatever messages reached them through entertainment and advertising. This passive approach to information consumption was equivalent to leaving the gates of a fortress wide open and allowing anyone to enter without inspection or challenge. The inevitable result was mental contamination, the gradual accumulation of false beliefs, manipulated emotions, and distorted perceptions that made independent thinking increasingly difficult. Information hygiene required developing the discipline to actively choose what information to consume, from what sources, and in what quantities. It meant learning to recognize the difference between information that expanded understanding and information that merely confirmed existing biases. It demanded the courage to seek out perspectives that challenged comfortable assumptions, while maintaining enough discrimination to reject sources that were clearly manipulative or unreliable. Machiavelli developed specific practices for maintaining information hygiene. He would deliberately expose himself to viewpoints from across the political spectrum, but he would study them analytically rather than absorbing them emotionally. He learned to identify the rhetorical techniques being employed and the emotional responses they were designed to trigger. He practiced reading between the lines to understand what information was being omitted or downplayed, and why. Perhaps most importantly, he maintained what he called informational sovereignty. He refused to allow any single source or type of source to become his primary lens for understanding reality. He insisted on multiple perspectives on important issues, and he developed the ability to hold competing viewpoints in tension while gathering additional information and conducting his own analysis. The second pillar of mental defense was emotional discipline, the systematic development of the ability to recognize, understand, and control emotional responses to manipulation attempts. Emotions were not the enemy in this process, they were valuable sources of information about one's environment and internal state. The problem arose when emotions were artificially triggered by external manipulators and, then, used to override rational judgment. Developing emotional discipline required first becoming conscious of one's emotional patterns and triggers. Most people lived in a state of emotional unconsciousness, reacting to stimuli without awareness of the process or the possibility of choice in their responses. They would feel angry, afraid, or excited without stopping to ask why they were feeling these emotions, whether the emotions were proportionate to the actual situation, or whether the emotions were serving their own interests or someone else's. Machiavelli trained himself to create what he called emotional distance, a brief pause between stimulus and response that allowed for conscious analysis of what was happening. When he encountered information or situations designed to trigger strong emotional reactions, he would step back mentally and ask himself a series of questions. What emotion is this designed to make me feel? What action is this emotion supposed to motivate? Who benefits if I act on this emotion? What additional information do I need before making any decisions? This practice did not eliminate emotional responses. Indeed, Machiavelli found that understanding the manipulation made him feel deeper and more appropriate anger toward those who attempted it. But it prevented him from being unconsciously directed by emotions that were artificially induced for someone else's benefit. The development of emotional discipline also required learning to recognize and counter specific emotional manipulation techniques. Fearmongering, for example, typically involved presenting threats that were either exaggerated or taken out of context, combined with proposed solutions that happened to benefit the fearmonger. Learning to recognize this pattern made it possible to evaluate threats rationally rather than reactively. Similarly, appeals to anger usually involved directing attention toward convenient targets while obscuring the actual sources of problems. Appeals to hope and desire typically involved promises of benefits that were either impossible to deliver or came with hidden costs that were not disclosed until after commitment. Appeals to pride and identity typically involved flattering the target's sense of superiority while encouraging behaviors that actually served the manipulator's interests. The third element of mental defense was what Machiavelli called strategic thinking, the habit of analyzing situations from multiple perspectives and considering long-term consequences rather than immediate appearances. Most people thought tactically rather than strategically. They focused on immediate problems and opportunities without considering how their responses might be anticipated and exploited by more far-sighted opponents. Strategic thinking began with the recognition that in any complex social situation, multiple parties had different agendas and were actively working to influence outcomes in their favor. The naive approach was to assume that information and proposals were presented in good faith by parties who had one's best interests at heart. The strategic approach was to assume that every party was working primarily for their own benefit and to analyze their motivations and methods accordingly. This did not require becoming cynical or paranoid. Indeed, excessive suspicion could be as harmful as excessive trust. It required developing the ability to think like potential manipulators in order to recognize and counter their techniques. Machiavelli would regularly engage in thought experiments where he imagined how he would attempt to manipulate someone in his position, what techniques he would use, and what responses would be most effective. This practice made him far more sensitive to manipulation attempts by others. Strategic thinking also required developing what he called temporal perspective, the ability to consider how current situations and decisions would play out over longer time horizons. Manipulators typically focused their targets on immediate concerns while obscuring long-term consequences. They would emphasize urgent problems that required immediate action, while downplaying or ignoring the potential negative effects of proposed solutions. A strategically minded person would always ask, if I accept this analysis and take the recommended action, what position will I be in 6 months, 1 year, or 5 years from now? Who will benefit from the changes that result? What options am I giving up by committing to this course of action? What precedents am I setting that might be exploited in future situations? The fourth pillar of mental defense was what Machiavelli termed network awareness, understanding how one's social environment influenced thought and behavior, and taking active steps to maintain intellectual independence despite social pressures. Humans were fundamentally social creatures, and their beliefs and behaviors were powerfully shaped by the groups they belonged to or aspired to join. This social influence was so fundamental that most people were completely unconscious of its operation. Skilled manipulators understood how to exploit social dynamics to achieve their goals. They would create artificial social pressures that made certain positions seem universally accepted or personally beneficial to adopt. They would use social proof, authority figures, and peer pressure to make their targets feel that resistance to influence was socially unacceptable or personally costly. Developing network awareness required honest assessment of one's own social environment and the pressures it created. Machiavelli would regularly analyze the groups he belonged to, the authority figures he respected, and the social rewards and punishments that influenced his behavior. He learned to recognize when his opinions were being shaped more by social pressure than by independent analysis. He also developed what he called social diversification, deliberately maintaining relationships and information sources across different social networks to avoid becoming trapped within any single ideological bubble. He cultivated friendships with people who held different political views, economic interests, and cultural backgrounds. He read materials produced by various factions and schools of thought. He traveled to different regions and observed how the same issues were understood differently in different contexts. This social diversification served multiple purposes. It provided access to a broader range of information and perspectives. It made it more difficult for any single group to exert total influence over his thinking. It also provided early warning when manipulation attempts were being made, because he could observe how different groups were being targeted with different messages designed to move them toward the same conclusions through different emotional appeals. Perhaps most importantly, social diversification helped maintain what Machiavelli considered the most precious asset for mental defense: intellectual humility. People who lived within homogeneous social networks typically developed excessive confidence in their beliefs and strong emotional attachments to their positions. This confidence and attachment made them vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who could pose as a defender of their beliefs or an enemy of their opponents. Intellectual humility, the recognition that one's understanding of complex issues was always incomplete and potentially mistaken, was perhaps the strongest defense against manipulation. A person who held beliefs lightly and was willing to change them based on new evidence could not be easily controlled by those who sought to exploit fixed positions and emotional attachments. The fifth and final element of the fortress of autonomous thought was what Machiavelli called operational security, practical measures to protect one's mind and decisions from external interference. Just as a military commander would protect sensitive information and decision-making processes from enemy intelligence gathering, an individual seeking mental autonomy had to develop habits that prevented manipulators from gaining the access and information they needed to mount effective influence campaigns. Operational security began with privacy practices that limited how much personal information was available to potential manipulators. In Machiavelli's time, this meant being careful about what one revealed in conversations and correspondence. He recognized that the same principles would apply to any future technologies that might emerge for gathering and analyzing personal information. The key insight was that personal information, preferences, fears, desires, social relationships, financial situation, health concerns, was raw material for manipulation. The more someone knew about a target, the more precisely they could craft influence attempts. Therefore, protecting personal information was not merely a matter of privacy preference, but a fundamental requirement for maintaining mental independence. Operational security also required developing decision-making processes that were resistant to external pressure and manipulation. Machiavelli learned to make important decisions through systematic analysis rather than emotional reaction. He would gather information from multiple sources, analyze it using consistent criteria, and consult with trusted advisors who had demonstrated their ability to provide honest rather than flattering counsel. He also developed what he called decision isolation, practices that prevented external parties from rushing him into choices before he had completed his analysis. He would refuse to make important decisions under time pressure unless the urgency was clearly genuine and unavoidable. He would insist on having adequate time to consult independent sources and think through implications. He would resist social pressure to commit to positions before he was confident they served his actual interests. The culmination of these defensive practices was what Machiavelli termed authentic agency, the ability to act according to one's own carefully considered judgment rather than in response to external manipulation. This was not the same as stubbornness or isolation. It required being open to legitimate influence while rejecting attempts at illegitimate control. It meant being willing to change one's mind when presented with convincing evidence, while refusing to be pushed around by those who sought to exploit psychological vulnerabilities for their own benefit. Authentic agency was the ultimate goal of mental defense, but it was also the foundation for everything that made life worth living. Without the ability to think independently and act according to one's own judgment, a person became merely an instrument of others' will, regardless of how comfortable or successful their external circumstances might appear. Part 3, The Counteroffensive of Intellectual Independence. As Machiavelli perfected his understanding of mental defense, he came to realize that protection alone was insufficient for maintaining true intellectual independence. Like a fortress that could successfully repel attacks but remained forever under siege, a mind that only defended itself would gradually lose vitality and effectiveness. The highest form of mental sovereignty required not just resistance to manipulation, but the active cultivation of authentic intellectual power that could compete with and ultimately overcome the forces of mental control. The transition from defensive to offensive thinking began with what he called reality construction, the recognition that perception of reality was not simply a matter of passively receiving accurate information about objective facts. Instead, he understood that human perception always involved active interpretation and that this interpretive process could be trained to serve either authentic understanding or manipulated illusion. Most people were unconscious participants in their own reality construction. They allowed their perceptions to be shaped by whatever influences were strongest in their environment, whether these influences served truth or deception. They would absorb the dominant narratives of their time and place without recognizing that these narratives were constructions that reflected the interests and biases of their creators. Machiavelli developed techniques for taking conscious control of his own reality construction process. He learned to recognize that every piece of information came embedded within interpretive frameworks that shaped how it would be understood. He practiced separating raw facts from the narratives used to explain them, and then developing his own interpretive frameworks based on careful analysis rather than passive absorption. This process required developing what he called narrative consciousness, the ability to recognize and analyze the stories that people told themselves about reality, and to understand how these stories influenced behavior and decision-making. He observed that humans were fundamentally storytelling creatures who organized their experience through narrative structures. The stories they believed about themselves, their relationships, their society, and their place in history determined how they interpreted events and what actions they considered possible or appropriate. Manipulators were skilled story crafters who understood how to create compelling narratives that would lead their targets to desired conclusions. They would embed their propaganda within emotionally satisfying stories that made their audience feel heroic, victimized, threatened, or destined for greatness. The power of these stories lay not in their factual accuracy but in their psychological appeal and their ability to provide meaning and direction for people who felt lost or uncertain. Developing narrative consciousness meant learning to step outside the stories and examine them analytically. Machiavelli would ask himself, what story am I being told about this situation? What role am I being cast to play in this story? Who benefits if this story is believed and acted upon? What alternative stories might fit the same facts? What evidence would I need to evaluate which story was most accurate? This practice revealed that many of the conflicts and problems that seemed intractable were actually conflicts between competing stories rather than conflicts over objective facts. Different groups had developed different narratives about the same situations, and they were defending their stories rather than seeking truth. Understanding this dynamic made it possible to step outside the narrative conflicts and analyze situations more objectively. The second element of intellectual counteroffensive was what Machiavelli termed agency amplification, the systematic development of one's ability to influence outcomes rather than merely react to circumstances. Most people lived in what he recognized as a state of perpetual reactivity, responding to events and influences rather than actively shaping their environment according to their own vision and values. This reactive stance was both a symptom and a cause of mental vulnerability. People who saw themselves primarily as victims of circumstances were more susceptible to those who promised to solve their problems or protect them from threats. They were willing to surrender autonomy in exchange for security or relief, not recognizing that the surrender itself often perpetuated the problems they sought to escape. Agency amplification began with mental exercises designed to shift from reactive to proactive thinking. Instead of asking, "What is happening to me and how should I respond?" Machiavelli trained himself to ask, "What do I want to accomplish and how can I shape circumstances to achieve it?" This shift in questioning fundamentally changed how he processed information and made decisions. He developed what he called outcome visualization, the practice of clearly defining desired future states and then working backward to identify the actions and resources needed to achieve them. This was different from wishful thinking or positive visualization. it was a systematic planning process that began with realistic assessment of current conditions and available resources, proceeded through careful analysis of obstacles and opportunities, and culminated in specific action plans with measurable milestones. Outcome visualization served multiple purposes in defending against manipulation. It provided clear criteria for evaluating information and proposals. Anything that moved him toward his genuine goals was useful, while anything that diverted him from those goals was suspect regardless of how it was presented. It also made it easier to recognize when others were trying to substitute their goals for his own through emotional manipulation or deceptive framing. Agency amplification also required developing what Machiavelli called resource consciousness, comprehensive understanding of the assets, capabilities, and opportunities available for achieving one's objectives. Most people drastically underestimated their own power and resources, which made them more dependent on external authorities and more vulnerable to those who claimed to control access to necessary resources. He learned to catalog not just obvious resources like money and property, but also personal capabilities, social relationships, information and knowledge, reputation and credibility, and strategic positioning. He understood that power in complex social systems came from the ability to combine resources creatively rather than from simple accumulation of assets. This resource consciousness served as a foundation for what he considered the most important aspect of agency amplification: strategic initiative, the ability to set agendas and create options rather than simply choosing among alternatives defined by others. People who operated solely in reactive mode were constantly forced to choose among options that others had created, which meant that all available choices served someone else's interests rather than their own. Strategic initiative required learning to create new options that had not previously existed, to reframe problems in ways that opened different solution paths, and to change the rules of engagement rather than simply playing more effectively within existing rules. This was perhaps the highest form of intellectual independence, the ability to step outside the frameworks that others created and to develop original approaches to problems. The third element of intellectual counteroffensive was influence resistance training, deliberate exposure to manipulation attempts under controlled conditions in order to build immunity to such attempts in real-world situations. Just as physical immunity could be developed through controlled exposure to pathogens, psychological immunity could be developed through controlled exposure to manipulation techniques. Machiavelli realized that most people were vulnerable to manipulation precisely because they had never systematically studied how it worked or practiced resisting it. They encountered manipulation attempts for the first time during moments of stress or uncertainty when their psychological defenses were already compromised. Under such conditions, even relatively crude manipulation techniques could be effective. He began deliberately exposing himself to various forms of propaganda, sales tactics, political rhetoric, and social pressure while maintaining analytical detachment and practicing resistance techniques. He would attend political rallies and religious services not as a true believer but as a student of influence techniques. He would engage with skilled salespeople and negotiators to observe their methods and test his ability to maintain independent judgment under pressure. This practice served multiple purposes. It familiarized him with the full range of manipulation techniques so that he could recognize them quickly when encountered in important situations. It allowed him to test and refine his defensive techniques in low-stakes environments. Most importantly, it desensitized him to the emotional impact of manipulation attempts, making him less likely to be overwhelmed or intimidated when faced with sophisticated influence campaigns. Influence resistance training also involved studying the psychology and techniques of successful manipulators, not to emulate them, but to understand their methods and develop countermeasures. Machiavelli read the works of great propagandists, studied the techniques of successful cult leaders and demagogues, and analyzed the methods of skilled confidence artists and social engineers. This study was initially disturbing because it revealed how sophisticated and effective manipulation techniques could be when properly applied. However, it ultimately served to strengthen his defenses by eliminating the naive assumption that good intentions and common sense would be sufficient protection against dedicated manipulation efforts. The fourth component of intellectual counteroffensive was what Machiavelli called truth-seeking infrastructure, the development of systematic methods for discovering and verifying accurate information about important topics. Most people's relationship with truth was passive and haphazard. They hoped that accurate information would somehow reach them through normal channels, and they lacked reliable methods for distinguishing truth from deception when conflicts arose. This passive approach to truth-seeking was completely inadequate for maintaining intellectual independence in environments where powerful interests were actively working to distort information flow. It required developing proactive research capabilities and verification methods that could function independently of potentially compromised information sources. Truth-seeking infrastructure began with understanding the difference between information and knowledge. Information was raw data about events and conditions. Knowledge was information that had been verified, contextualized, and integrated into coherent understanding. Most of what people consumed was neither information nor knowledge, but interpretation, someone else's analysis, and conclusions presented as objective fact. Machiavelli learned to trace information back to its original sources whenever possible, to distinguish between first-hand accounts and second-hand interpretations, and to identify the motivations and biases of information sources. He developed networks of reliable observers and informants who could provide direct reports about events and conditions in areas where he lacked personal access. He also learned to use what he called triangulation, gathering information about the same events or conditions from multiple independent sources and comparing their accounts to identify areas of agreement and disagreement. When sources disagreed, he would investigate further to understand the reasons for the discrepancies. When sources agreed, he would still verify that they were truly independent rather than simply repeating information from common sources. Perhaps most importantly, he developed the discipline to withhold judgment when adequate information was not available. This was psychologically difficult because humans naturally sought closure and certainty, but it was essential for maintaining intellectual integrity. He learned to say "I don't know" when evidence was insufficient, and to hold competing hypotheses in tension while gathering additional information. Truth-seeking infrastructure also required developing what he called historical consciousness, understanding how current events and conditions were shaped by longer-term historical processes. Manipulators typically focused their targets on immediate concerns while ignoring historical context that might reveal the manipulator's true intentions or the likely consequences of proposed actions. Machiavelli studied historical patterns to understand how similar situations had developed in the past, what factors had influenced their outcomes, and what lessons could be applied to current circumstances. This historical perspective provided protection against manipulation attempts that relied on making current situations seem unprecedented or uniquely urgent. The final element of intellectual counteroffensive was what Machiavelli called vision projection, the ability to articulate and communicate alternative possibilities that could inspire and guide others toward more authentic and beneficial outcomes. The highest form of intellectual independence was not simply protecting oneself from manipulation, but contributing to the creation of environments where manipulation was less necessary and less effective. Vision projection required developing the ability to imagine and describe realistic alternatives to current conditions that would address genuine human needs and aspirations. This was different from utopian fantasizing or idealistic dreaming. It required understanding real constraints and possibilities while refusing to accept that current limitations were permanent or inevitable. Machiavelli understood that people were most vulnerable to manipulation when they felt hopeless or trapped, when they could not imagine better alternatives to their current circumstances. Manipulators exploited this vulnerability by positioning themselves as the only source of relief or improvement, even when their proposed solutions actually perpetuated or worsened the underlying problems. By articulating authentic alternatives and demonstrating their feasibility, it became possible to reduce the desperation that made manipulation effective. People who could see multiple paths forward were less likely to surrender their autonomy to anyone who claimed to offer the only way out of their difficulties. Vision projection also served to inspire and coordinate the efforts of others who shared similar values and objectives. One of the greatest sources of power for manipulators was their ability to coordinate the efforts of large numbers of people through shared narratives and emotional appeals. Developing authentic alternatives to manipulative coordination required creating equally compelling but more truthful narratives that could guide collective action toward beneficial outcomes. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of intellectual counteroffensive because it required not just individual development but social leadership. It meant taking responsibility not only for one's own mental freedom but for contributing to conditions that would support the mental freedom of others. It required developing the communication skills, moral courage, and practical wisdom needed to influence social conditions in positive directions. The integration of all these elements, reality construction, agency amplification, influence resistance training, truth-seeking infrastructure, and vision projection, created what Machiavelli considered the highest form of human development, authentic intellectual leadership. This was the ability to maintain mental independence while helping others develop their own capacity for independent thought and action. Such individuals became centers of resistance to manipulation and sources of genuine alternatives to manipulative control systems. They could not be easily co-opted or neutralized because their power came from internal development rather than external position. They were dangerous to manipulators precisely because they demonstrated that authentic autonomy was possible and attractive to others. As Machiavelli refined these principles and observed their effects in his own life and in the lives of others who adopted similar approaches, he came to understand that the battle for mental freedom was not just an individual struggle but a crucial component of the broader human quest for dignity, justice, and authentic community. The principles that protected individual minds from control were the same principles that protected societies from tyranny and communities from corruption. The ruthless defense of mental sovereignty was not a retreat from social engagement but a preparation for more effective and ethical social participation. Only individuals who had achieved authentic intellectual independence could contribute to collective endeavors without becoming unwitting instruments of hidden agendas or destructive delusions. In his final years, walking again through the streets of Florence, Machiavelli observed how these principles played out in the complex dance of human interaction that continued around him. He saw merchants who had learned to resist the manipulation of their customers, citizens who could evaluate political promises with clear eyes, scholars who pursued truth rather than advancement, and leaders who served authentic rather than manufactured interests. He also saw the ongoing struggle between those who sought to control minds and those who sought to free them, understanding that this struggle would continue as long as humans lived in complex social arrangements. But he had provided weapons for that struggle, not perfect solutions, but proven principles that could tip the balance toward freedom for those with the wisdom to understand them and the courage to apply them consistently. The mind, properly fortified and skillfully employed, remained unconquerable by any force that relied on deception, emotional manipulation, or false authority. In a world where such forces were constantly at work, this knowledge was perhaps the most valuable inheritance one could leave to future generations seeking to preserve their humanity in the face of those who would reduce them to instruments of control.